For Christmas this year, my siblings and I purchased an ancestry kit for my parents. We thought that it would be fun to discover the geographic and ethnic origins of our family. For years, we had the story of our ancestors coming from Germany, but we were intrigued to learn whether there was more to that narrative than what had been passed down to us. My sister even wondered aloud if there might be something truly unexpected in our DNA, a trace far distant from our Northern European narrative. Ancestry DNA has capitalized on this curiosity. Its commercials show people meeting with Native American elders and Scottish fishermen and traveling to distant parts of Asia to learn about their previously unknown genetic origins. These images project excitement for discovering a new sense of belonging, of uncovering a past that tells people who they are. And perhaps that is one of the experiences of taking the test. But I think that it is more complex than that, too. Reactions to discovering the results are different depending on family background and beliefs and personal circumstance. For example, there are some folks who have taken this test and gotten a real surprise. About a month ago on Facebook, a video popped up. This one was of a group of people who had taken such a test. They also happened to hold explicitly racist views. They were asked what they thought they would discover in the results, and all of them said that they were sure it would reveal 100% European ancestry. To their surprise, and to many viewers' delight, including mine, those tests did not reveal that. And instead, these people learned that they had ancestral origins that clearly conflicted with their racist beliefs. They were shocked, and they had to rethink things. And as far as I am concerned, anything that helps to debunk the bad science and pernicious influence of racism is a good thing. Now, sometimes the response to the test has been a much deeper sense of coming home, one that is much deeper than what the Ancestry DNA commercials tell us. Many people of the African diaspora did not know which part of the continent of Africa their ancestors had been taken from. The ancestry tests in this instance provided a vital link to a past that had been broken by the brutal institution and practice of slavery. And so some African Americans have greeted the results with a powerful feeling of coming home. We lost our families. We lost our names. We knew our beginnings in only the most generic sense, writes one African American man. He continues, this test provides a new piece of the puzzle. I also know that some people, after an initial mild surprise at the results, have put the test aside and moved on to other things. Many seem to greet the results of these ancestry tests with something of a shrug, and they are far from adopting new cultural habits because of it. My own family's results represents this approach, I think. We learned that we have a lot more of a Scottish and British Isles heritage than we had initially thought. It actually outweighed the Germany narrative that we had, though we had that too. And while that has been interesting for us, it has not made me want to rush off and start raising sheep in a kilt. My own feeling is that knowing this culture of origin does not offer a whole lot of helpful information on how to live in the present. It remains distant and removed despite the genetic connection. What all of this shows, I think, is that the commercials from Ancestry DNA are somewhat misleading. There's not necessarily an automatic sense of belonging that adheres to the data that test takers receive. What is much more important is how we interpret that information. Our approach to DNA and genetic origins is fundamentally a question of human meaning making. And it is important to remember that this act is not a purely individual act of meaning making. It is tied in with social and ideological beliefs that have shaped our world for centuries. Some of these understandings are relatively harmless, such as the question of which part of the British Isles someone comes from. Other understandings are much more fraught, linked as they are to a system of racial interpretation that has perpetuated brutality for centuries. Now, I offer a sermon each year at the church auction. At least that's what I had done when I was serving as a minister in Livermore and what I plan to do out here at North Shore Unitarian Church. And this year, Debbie and Russ Krochuk had the winning bid. They asked me to preach on the Baha'i perspective on racial unity. And this is something that I admit I knew little about. It has been an opportunity for me to learn something new, and I'm really grateful for that. So thank you. Through reading about the Baha'i approach and speaking with individual members of the Baha'i Faith in the last couple of weeks, I've come to believe that the religion has something important to contribute to the conversation about race here in our country. It is one part of the puzzle for how we might respond to the complicated issues that emerge as we seek to undo racism and work for a more compassionate world. I'd like to explore that a bit today and also offer as a complement the approach to race and racism that Unitarian Universalism has been pursuing in recent years. I think that these are indeed complementary to each other. Now, the story of the Baha'i Faith is a story of immigration, of persecution, and finally of flourishing in a global context. The religion began in 1844 in Iran when a man known as the Bab began preaching a new interpretation of Shia Islam. He declared himself a prophet, and 6 short years later, he was publicly executed by authorities. But before he died, the Bab promised that a new messenger would come. Baha'u'llah was the man who took up this mantle. He began preaching a message of unity and of appreciation of difference, which soon spread throughout the world. The mainstays of the faith are the unity of God, the unity of religion, and the unity of humanity. This last one, the unity of humanity, was essential to Baha'u'llah's vision. In one place he says, "The world of humanity, too, is like a garden, and humankind are like many colored flowers. Therefore, different colors constitute an adornment." In another place, the prophet put it this way: "Animals, despite the fact that they lack reason and understanding, do not make colors the cause of conflict. Why should man, who has reason, create conflict? This is wholly unworthy of him." Nowhere in these writings is there an idea that human beings all look the same or should look the same, or that we should be colorblind. Rather, Baha'u'llah encouraged appreciation for the differences that the human family portrayed. Hence, since its inception, the Baha'i Faith began working for unity and ending prejudice wherever it encountered it. Now, the Baha'i religion came to America in the late 19th century, urged on by a surge of interest of world religions at that time. Some of you may be aware that Chicago was the epicenter for this, with the Parliament of World Religions taking place right alongside the World's Fair. This event, which was actually heavily organized by Unitarians and Universalists, was one of the first times that the Baha'i Faith was mentioned in the United States. And I was excited to see that not long after, newspapers began to show Baha'i leaders being invited to Unitarian pulpits. You can see an example of this on the cover of your order of service, where Baha'u'llah's son and successor, Abdul-Baha, was invited to the Oakland Unitarian Church pulpit. I thought that was a really cool little piece of history I was able to pluck off the internet this week. Oh, San Francisco. Okay. So historically, this period has been described as the nadir of race relations in the United States, and I think that that is an important piece of this history of the Baha'i Faith arriving in America. It was a time when Jim Crow policies and bigotry were fierce. Ugly racist views pervaded the culture in countless ways, and an article published just this week is one fascinating and tragic example of this. The article, which was published in the New York Times, chronicles the racist underpinnings of all things, National Geographic magazine during the early 20th century. One historian put it this way: while we tend to think of National Geographic as a bastion of appreciation for cultural diversity, this was not the case for a good chunk of its existence. National Geographic reproduced a racial hierarchy with brown and black people at the bottom and white people at the top. In 1916, just as Abdul-Baha was making his rounds in the United States, the magazine wrote about the inherent lack of intelligence of Australian people of color. In countless other articles and pictures, it showed people of color almost exclusively in tribal and jungle settings, and white people almost exclusively in cities, reinforcing destructive racial stereotypes. This week, the magazine apologized for its past. With attitudes like this so strong and so persistent in the early decades of the 20th century, it is admirable that the Baha'i Faith persisted in preaching a message of ending prejudice. Abdul-Baha, Baha'u'llah's son and successor, began to travel throughout the United States, spreading the Baha'i message of unity of humankind. His actions, which were often bold and controversial, upset the status quo. One example, which I retell from a Baha'i publication, is this. In 1912, in Washington, D.C., Abdul-Baha set the tone for how he approached race at a luncheon that was held in his honor. It was held at the home of a prominent Persian diplomat who was also a Baha'i. Abdul-Baha took his place looking around the elegant dining room at the white faces where everyone was seated according to rank and social position and in keeping with strict Washington protocol. Right away, Abdul-Baha stood up and asked his host, "Where is Mr. Gregory? Bring Mr. Gregory." Because of the racist social protocol of the time, Abdul-Baha's escort, the African-American attorney Louis Gregory, had not been invited to the dinner. The embarrassed host had no choice but to hastily rearrange the place settings and make room for the extra guest. Abdul-Baha insisted that Mr. Gregory occupy the honored place to his right at the head of the table. Thus, Abdul-Baha defied Washington protocol and swept aside the practice of segregation by race and social rank, setting a powerful example and challenging the customs of the deeply divided capital city. And throughout his U.S. visit, Abdul-Baha insisted that every venue that he spoke at be open to people of all races and origins. And the Baha'i Faith has, in many ways and through many examples like these, continued on a journey towards unity and challenging prejudice. I believe that this is a worthy piece of the puzzle, and it is a noble history to hold up. And I think that there's a lot that Unitarian Universalists and the Baha'i Faith can partner on around this work. We're both committed to ending prejudice and seeking solutions to racism. For its part, the Unitarian Universalist approach has been to emphasize the ways that power has prevented racial unity from fully taking shape and beginning to find ways to challenge those power structures. Our belief is that only by acknowledging and challenging the systems of power that hold racist structures in place will we begin to make a real difference on this issue. Now, there are lots of examples of how this power works to maintain systems that oppress and exclude. For instance, there are economic benefits that emerge from a racist social structure. Through the practice of mass incarceration, the prison industrial complex has lined its pockets by disproportionately convicting people of color. Politicians and judges have received kickbacks from locking more people up, a practice which again has targeted disproportionately people of color. This is further exacerbated by the unequal ways that we treat communities of Black and white citizens in our country. When drugs pervade Black communities, the problem is considered a crime that needs to be solved through incarceration. When opioids, which are just as dangerous, invade white communities, it's considered an epidemic that needs to be treated with more medical treatment options. Moreover, in communities of color, inadequate schools and scarce resources reduce the likelihood of success. This reinforces a system that traps people of color in poverty and increases the possibility of crime in those areas. Now, that's a lot of information, but to me, what it shows is that the problems that are associated with race are problems of power. They're problems of power. They are pieces of a complex system, and until we address these problems of power, our efforts at unity are going to be limited. I think back to those DNA histories that I mentioned at the beginning of this sermon. The truth is that many people of color have not been given the privilege of interpreting their own genetic history. Instead, a system of power has done that for them. And if we are going to correct this, if we hope to make some kind of change around this issue, we are going to need to partner with each other to make a difference. I hope that we can get to the place where we see each other as radiant lights, to quote Baha'u'llah, to a place where we affirm the inherent beauty in each person, working with each other to challenge prejudice and undo pervasive systems of power that marginalize and oppress are crucial pieces of this puzzle. With the courage that we find in each other and sincere effort towards this common cause, I have every hope that we will be able to do that. Amen. I love you, and blessings.